Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another session of this course on Islamic inheritance law, in which we shall be looking at the inheritance share of a hermaphrodite. Let's start off with text from the Sirajiyya. للخنثى المشكل أقل النصيبين أعني أسوأ الحالين عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى وأصحابه، وهو قول عامة الصحابة رضي الله تعالى عنهم وعليه. الفتوى كما إذا ترك ابنا وبنتا وخنثى، للخنثى نصيب بنت لأنه متيقن. وعند الشعبي رضي الله تعالى عنه، وهو قول ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما، للخنثى نصف النصيبين بالمنازعة. واختلفا في تخريج قول الشعبي. قال أبو يوسف رحمه الله تعالى: للابن سهم، وللبنت نصف سهم، وللخنثى 3/4 سهم، لأن الخنثى يستحق سهما إن كان ذكرا، ونصف سهم إن كان أنثى، وهذا متيقن، فيأخذ نصف النصيبين أو النصف المتيقن مع نصف النصف المتنازع فيه، فصارت له 3/4 سهم، ومجموع الأنصباء 2.25 سهم، لأنه يعتبر السهام والعول وتصح من 9. أو نقول: للابن سهمان، وللبنت سهم، وللخنثى نصف النصيبين وهو سهم ونصف سهم. وقال محمد رحمه الله تعالى: يأخذ الخنثى 1/5 المال إن كان ذكرا، وربع المال إن كان أنثى، فيأخذ نصف النصيبين، وذلك 5 و8 باعتبار الحالين، وتصح من 40، وهو المجتمع من ضرب إحدى المسيلتين، وهي 4 في الأخرى، وهي 5، ثم في الحالتين، فمن كان له شيء من 5 فمضروب في 4، ومن كان له شيء من 4 فمضروب في 5، فصارت للخنثى من الضربين 13 سهما، وللابن 18 سهما، وللبنت 9 أسهم. Al-Khuntha al-Mushkal refers to a person whose gender cannot be clearly determined even when they reach puberty, or someone who passed away as a child before their gender could be identified. In Islamic law, the rules for inheritance are closely linked to gender. So, determining the gender of a khuntha is essential. The classical Muslim jurists have provided guidelines to help determine the gender of a child in difficult cases. If a khuntha urinates through a male organ, then for the purposes of inheritance, they are considered male. If a khuntha urinates through a female organ, they are considered female. Now sometimes, urine may come from both male and female organs. In this case, whichever organ urine passes through first is used to determine the person's gender. If, however, this method does not give a clear answer, even at puberty, then scholars look for secondary sexual characteristics, signs such as the growth of a beard, occurrence of wet dreams, development of breasts, or menstruation, to help determine gender. And if, after all these observations, the gender still cannot be determined, then the person is classified as khuntha mushkal, a person whose gender is truly ambiguous in the eyes of Islamic law. According to the Hanfi fiqh, the share of the khuntha mushkal is calculated both as a male and as a female, and then the person is given the smaller of the 2 shares. This is the view of the majority of Hanafi scholars, the majority of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is also one of the 2 opinions recorded in Imam Shafi'i's school. Specifically, Imam Abu Hanifa held that a khuntha should be considered a female unless proven otherwise. Another opinion is that the khuntha mushkal inherits an average share, meaning half of the male share plus half of the female share. This method is known as the doctrine of al-Shabi, and it was the opinion of Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. Some Maliki and Hanbali scholars have also adopted this approach. Let's look at some examples to understand the inheritance share of the kunta. In this example, Suhail dies, leaving a son, a daughter, and a child who is a kuntha. Let's work out all the possibilities. If the kunta is taken as a female, she inherits as a daughter. So we have the heirs as 2 daughters and 1 son. The son inherits 1/2 and each daughter. If the kunta is taken as a male, she inherits as a son. So we have the heirs as 2 sons and 1 daughter. Each son inherits 2/5 and the daughter inherits 1/5. Let now allow the kunta to inherit half the share of the male, meaning as a son, and half the share of a female as a daughter. This is the doctrine of al-Shabi, which can be applied in 2 different ways. Imam Yusuf assigns the kunta portion of 1.5, while assigning the son 2 portions and the daughter 1 portion. The total number of portions is 4.5. So the distribution of the inheritance is 2/9 to the daughter, 4/9 to the son, and 3/9 to the kunta. Imam Yusuf's method simply fixes the ratios of the shares. Imam Muhammad's method uses the actual calculated share values. As a male, the kunta inherited 2/5, and as a female, the kunta inherited 1/4. So the inheritance share of the kunta is half of 1/4 plus 2/5, which equals 13/40. In a similar manner, we calculate share of son to be 9/20 and the daughter 9/40. The method that has been adopted by the jurists is that of Imam Muhammad. Let's look at another example. Suhail dies, leaving a daughter and a full sibling who is a kunta. In this example, the daughter will inherit her Quranic share of 1/2, and the kunta will inherit a half as a full sister or a half as a full brother. So the gender of the kunta does not change the share entitlement. In this example, Suhail dies, leaving a wife, a father, a mother, and a child who is a kunta. If the kunta is taken as a female, she inherits as a daughter. She inherits a Quranic share of 1/2. The widow inherits 1/8. The mother inherits 1/6, and the father inherits the remaining 5/24. If the kunta is taken as a male, he inherits as a son. The widow still inherits 1/8. The mother still inherits 1/6, and the father now inherits 1/6, and the kunta as a son inherits the remaining 13/24. So, if the kunta inherits as a female, that is, a daughter, she would be entitled to 1/2 of the estate. However, if the kunta inherits as a male, that is, a son, he would be entitled to 13/24 of the estate. 1/2 is smaller than 13/24. Therefore, according to the Hanfi fiqh, the kunta would inherit 1/2, and consequently the widow 1/8, the mother 1/6, and the father 5/24. According to the Shafi'i and Hanbali fiqh, each heir is given his/her minimum share. The widow 1/8, the mother 1/6, the father 1/6, and the hermaphrodite 1/2. The remaining 1/24 would be distributed when the gender of the kunta is established. According to the doctrine of al-Shabi, with each heir inheriting the average of the 2 calculated values, the distribution of the estate would be widow 1/8, father 9/48, mother 1/6, and kunta 25/48. In this example, Suhail dies, leaving behind 2 daughters, a full brother's child whose sex is difficult to determine, and a consanguine brother's son as the only heir. Pause the video if you want to do the calculations yourself first. Firstly, if the full brother's child inherits as a male, he will inherit as a nephew, meaning the full brother's son, in which case the daughters together will inherit 2/3 as Quranic heirs. The junta, as an agnatic nephew, will be the closest male relative and inherit the remaining inheritance of 1/3. The consanguine brother's son will be excluded by the full brother's son, that is, the junta being a male. If the full brother's child inherits as a female, he will inherit as a niece, which belongs to the Dhawil Arham class of heirs. So the distribution of inheritance will be that the daughters together will inherit 2/3 as Quranic heirs. The consanguine brother's son, as the closest male relative, will inherit the remaining inheritance of 1/3. The junta, as a female, will inherit nothing. According to the Hanfi fiqh, the junta would inherit nothing, that is, the smaller value of the 2 calculated shares. The 2 daughters would therefore inherit 1/3 each, and the consanguine brother's son would inherit 1/3. According to the Shafi'i and Hanbali fiqh, the 2 daughters would inherit 1/3. This is the minimum share to which they are entitled. The remaining 1/3 would be distributed when the gender of the full brother's son is determined at puberty. According to the doctrine of al-Shabi, with each heir inheriting the average of the 2 calculated values, the distribution of the estate would be that the daughters inherit 1/3 each, consanguine brother's son inherits 1/6, and the junta inherits 1/6. In this final example on the subject, a woman named Saima, leaving behind a husband, a full sister, and a consanguine sibling whose sex is difficult to determine as the only heirs. The junta will inherit either as consanguine brother or as a consanguine sister. If the junta inherits as a male, he inherits as a consanguine brother. The distribution of inheritance is that the husband will inherit a Quranic share of 1/2, and the full sister will also inherit a Quranic share of 1/2. The junta, as consanguine brother, will inherit as residuary, and there is no residue. If the junta inherits as a female, she inherits as a consanguine sister. The distribution of inheritance is that the husband will inherit a Quranic share of 1/2. The full sister will also inherit a Quranic share of 1/2, and the consanguine sister will inherit 1/6 Quranic heir. The sum total of the share is 8/6, so the doctrine of Awl is applied. The final share of the husband would be 3/7. The full sister's share would be 3/7, and the consanguine sister 1/7. According to the Hanfi fiqh, the junta would inherit nothing, that is, the smaller value of 2 calculated shares. The husband and the full sister would inherit 1/2 each. According to the Shafi'i and Hanbali fiqh, the 2 daughters would inherit 1/3. This is the minimum share to which they are entitled. The remaining 1/3 would be distributed when the gender of the full brother's son is determined at puberty. According to the doctrine of al-Shabi, with each heir inheriting the average of the 2 calculated values, the distribution of the estate would be that the husband inherits 13/28, full sister inherits 13/28, and the junta inherits 1/14. This brings us to the end of this session. Insha'Allah, see you in the next one.